Do you think that sexual liberation is a luxury belief for
Is
straight
sexual
people? Let's
liber
say,
yeah.
just so that, to narrow it
Yeah,
down.
right. Yeah. I mean, gay people can do whatever they want. I mean, there's no, I would never, yeah. Um, let's say, okay, so is it a luxury belief, sexual liberation? I mean, I guess I do have this kind of libertarian impulse in me. I understand it that when adults, they should be able to do what they want. But the problem is, like in the aggregate, once that becomes introduced and normalized and even promoted, of if it feels good, do it. Naturally, there are going to be unplanned pregnancies, and inevitably, there are going to be children born into less than optimal circumstances. And I think we've seen this over the last few decades. Like a thought experiment I like to give to people is, imagine you enter a time machine and go back to like 1946, and you tell people, the US or the UK, whatever, just, in the next couple of decades, there's going to be a pill you can take. Women aren't going to get pregnant unless, if they don't take, if they take this pill, they're not going to get pregnant. And even if they do, in the ensuing decades, abortion is going to be more and more accessible. And I know there's the whole Roe v. Wade thing going on in the U.S., but broadly speaking, it's abortion is still far more accessible today than in 1946. And so you ask these people, okay, there's going to be these reproductive technologies. Will there be more unplanned children being born or fewer? Will there be more kids in foster care and orphanages or fewer? Are there going to be more kids born to unmarried parents or fewer? And I think, most people in 1946 are going to say, like, that sounds like magic. That sounds like a miracle. We're never going to have like yeah, every parent is going to have this incredible power they can exert over when to have kids or not. And instead, what has happened is basically the opposite of what you would predict. And so, in a way, I think these reproductive technologies sort of facilitated sexual liberation. It introduced this idea that you can have sex without consequences. And in a way, we're actually seeing the consequences despite, or maybe even because of liberation and how that's intertwined with abortion and with the birth control pill and everything else. So, yeah, I mean, is it a luxury belief? I gave it a very narrow definition. Maybe especially when I was writing the initial essays around luxury beliefs, I was still in my PhD program. I still had this very sort of academic mindset, and so I gave it this narrow definition. And now the concept has kind of taken on a life of its own, and people apply it to like everything. Like, oh, this guy bought a Lexus. That's a luxury belief, which is not
I
what
was
it
going to
is.
ask as well, like,
But
what are the most
yeah,
annoying ways in which people
yeah.
misuse your idea? Because I've definitely seen it
What? Yeah,
misused.
I see it too. And I
Yeah.
get it. Like, what you introduce something and people, modify it and do their own thing with it. But the narrow definition I gave it, this kind of academic definition, is ideas and opinions that confer status on the elites while inflicting costs on the lower classes. And so if it meets those two categories, then it's a luxury belief. And notice the definition doesn't say anything about intent, whether it's deliberate or conscious or calculated, like, oh, he's holding this belief in order to raise his status. I don't say that's why. I'm just saying, does it raise the person's status, regardless of what's ever going on inside their mind? And does it have disproportionate costs on lower classes? And so sexual liberation, yeah, of course. Okay, so championing sexual freedom does confer status on the upper class, the elites, the educated, and yes, it does actually have disproportionate detrimental effects for the lower classes. Um, so, by that narrow definition, it would have to be a luxury belief.
There we go. There we go. I think it's, I mean, a more narrow example that I used in my book referring to the idea of luxury beliefs was to do with promoting the sex industry, the sex workers' work kind of view. But I mean, it was just kind of complicated, right? Because
Hmm.
when you hear people, members of the upper classes, saying that sex workers work and promoting it in that sense, they are normally doing it it does raise their status, right? At least in a lot of elite circles, it does. They're often doing it in a very self-conscious way, as in that they're actually trying. They think that they are promoting the interests of the vulnerable. They think that they are actually championing the poor. They're also raising their own status kind of because they're doing that. I mean, there's like an interesting sort of Christian thing going on there, right? Where it's seen as very, very commendable to champion the poor, but not necessarily there's kind of a disconnect between what you might think as a member of the upper class helps the poor and what actually does.
Well, if you're a member of the upper class, you have an obligation, I think, to really like give it a thorough analysis and don't just, oh, it makes me feel good, and at a superficial level it seems like it would help the poor and that's good enough. You shouldn't rely on good feelings and warm and fuzzies to decide whether something's going to help the poor or not. Like, actually look at the data, maybe have a few conversations with people who live in impoverished communities and ask them what they think. But instead, it's just like, oh, let me talk to a few academics and journalists and sociologists and people who claim to represent or speak on behalf of those groups, and that's good enough. I mean, it's a very kind of lazy way of thinking. That's like one of the things I've been, by now I'm used to it, but one of the things I was surprised by when I first started interacting with lots of educated people when I was 25, 26 years old, so I'd been an adult for a little while, was just, yeah, the kind of laziness and lack of clarity in people's thinking, despite having gone to college. Like, I went my whole life thinking, oh, people who go to college are smart, because I went to a place where people didn't go. And I had, I'd watch TV shows, and I'd watch like House or whatever TV show of highly educated, smart people, and that was my image of what an educated person was. And I discovered, no, they're like, most of them are pretty, I don't want to say they're dumb, but they're not as smart as you would predict.
Midwits.
Midwits, sure, yeah,
I mean, it's a
yeah,
very useful expression because the midwits are super super sensitive to social status. That's often what's going on, right, with people parroting silly things at places like Yale and Cambridge. That it's status seeking rather than truth seeking.
yeah. I mean, that's people want to look good to their peers, and I think like weirdly, the higher up you go, the more that concern prevails. I've shared surveys online indicating that the higher up you go in educational attainment, the more likely people are to agree that they're afraid of revealing their social and political views at work for fear of being fired or fear of spoiling future employment opportunities. And it's just fascinating, like, because you would expect the opposite. You would expect that as people get more educated and more occupational prestige and resources and all the things, they would be more open to speaking their minds because they have sort of less in the way of material concerns. But as you go up the ladder, you actually have more in the way of sort of social concerns, connections, and need for status. Like, the psychological concept of need for status is actually positively correlated with education and earnings. And yeah, a lot of the sort of social psychology around this is fascinating too.